You're listening to Talking Threat Intelligence, a podcast dedicated to uncovering the new challenges of today's threat landscape. Each episode, we connect with some of the world's leading practitioners to share stories from the front lines of corporate security. And now, on to the show.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Talking Threat Intelligence. I'm your host, Robert Value. And joining me back on the show today for the second time is one of my favorite guests, Tristan Laugher, product specialist here at Liferaft. Tristan, thanks for coming back on the show, man.
Thanks for having me, Rob. It's always nice to talk about the industry information and trends and what's going on. And it's nice to be back on the show.
Yeah, well, let's just jump right into that then. So one of the things that we were talking about before we hit record, how doxings are becoming a bigger and bigger problem for a lot of the clients and customers that you work with on a daily basis. So a lot of your work is focused on educating security teams on how they can use OSINT to spot and mitigate this issue, which I thought was really, really interesting. So why don't we just kind of step back? Let's give our listeners a little bit of a 101 introduction to this topic before diving into the meat of the episode. What exactly do you mean by doxing?
So doxing is just the act of revealing, identifying information about someone online. Somebody that is often high profile, could be something as simple as a name, address, phone number, or more in-depth information like financial information or more sensitive personal information. Other times it's just a large part of a data dump where there's kind of innocent bystanders of people that have been part of a larger data breach. And all of a sudden they become more high profile for whatever reason. And normally it's taken in a malicious intent to reveal that information against the person being doxed and derived from just dropping documents. It's been going on since pre-internet time. And really it's transitioned to be that online threat as opposed to sending letters or correspondence or information to a media source as it would have been done previously.
Any famous examples that you could share of what these look like?
Yeah, so normally it's dropped on a place like a paste site or a doxbin type site. And the one that I always circle back to probably is about 10 years old now, where it was some really famous political figures, presidents, presidential candidates, high-level executives, where it was dumping sensitive information like social insurance numbers or social security numbers, multiple addresses for their homes. And some of these people were very private individuals that you wouldn't typically see that type of information out there. But other times it's less profile, it's less high profile individuals. Recently, there was some examples with healthcare. It's examples with companies still working and operating in Russia, where it's really meant to intimidate those companies to pull down information. So without getting into specific names or businesses, it really does have a wide ranging potential impact for people to be doxed.
That's kind of an interesting point that you kind of mentioned there, how it's changed over time. It kind of started as the ways that hackers got back at each other back in the early internet days to attacking celebrities. And then now with how divided that we are as a society and how contentious everything is, now it's a lot of ordinary people are starting to get, if you have the wrong political views or if someone doesn't like who you work for or what your company is doing, you can or accidentally, I've seen some examples of that where you were just a innocent bystander of something and something you can be dragged into this too.
Yeah, absolutely. No, right now where it's such a polarizing political spectrum, pretty much now when anything takes place, nearly half of the population is anti whatever you're for. So there's always that threat, whether you're on one side or the other. And to your point about not always being malicious with information that gets publicly available, sometimes it's the kids saying, hey, my dad's at the soccer game, and they're posting the video from their kids' soccer games. And all of a sudden, one of the parents is a famous executive or somebody that does require that protective information. And, non-maliciously, they've now been identified. Information about their family's now been identified, which really puts everybody at risk for potential harm. Or sometimes it's not even harm. Sometimes it's people that just really love something. And sometimes that stalking risk can pose even a more serious risk.
Right. You kind of hinted at that there, but who's generally the type of people that are carrying out these doxings online?
It could be everything from hacker groups. It could be, activist type groups that, in the example of people that are not happy about companies still operating in Russia. Sometimes it's people with personal vendettas that, they're trying to wrong somebody that has perceivably wronged them in the past. Other times it's totally different. It's not even directed at an executive, some type of extortion or trying to pull money or payments from people with the threat of releasing sensitive pictures or images or recordings that could be detrimental to a brand or detrimental to somebody's just personally.
Your work, obviously, we're scanning across the web and finding these types of doxing from time to time. But where do you generally find them the most often?
We see a lot of information being posted on Doxxing. It's been around a long time. It's moved around a lot online. So always keeping tabs on a Doxxing-like site. Paste sites, also very popular for larger data dumps of information. And even just what we alluded to before, some of the more non-threatening, just traditional social media. Sometimes it's that unintentional act of posting something. Other times it's people trying to solicit information on social media. So it's not even the doxing of information that you need to be aware of. It's the people trying to acquire that information to see who they're interacting with and what level of risk they actually pose. So it could be anywhere from those doxbin, pastebin sites, even as granular as retail sites. If you purchased a home, a lot of times those retail sites have floor plans and schematics and names linked to it because it's public information often. So a lot of different ways different information can be made publicly available like that.
So in the context of corporate security, I mean, you've hinted at this in your previous answers, but what kind of risks would this present for, if I'm doing security for a VIP or a celebrity, what kind of risk do I have to be aware of if I discover my client's information has been published online?
Yeah. So, the first is obviously the immediate risk of physical threat. If they're posting addresses, itineraries, schedules, where somebody's going to be located, that can place a threat actor in close proximity to an individual with that access to information to physically show up and harm them. Others, it could be reputational or brand. The example of companies working in Russia still, a lot of those companies received a lot of really negative public feedback, people boycotting products, things of that nature. And that can obviously have a really wide effect on not just the individual, but also the company as a whole, which could eventually force somebody out of work. There's always that risk of identity theft as well. If it's banking information or social security information, that could be used for fraudulent activity. So there's all kinds of different ways somebody can actually impact somebody's life through doxing, some very overt and others that generally take a little more time to reach that stage of truly threatening. I'll say I'm doxed online. There's identifying information about me, but until I'm incredibly famous, it's not going to prove much value to those individuals. So lots of ways it can be leveraged.
I thought too, I've had conversations with a lot of people about this issue over the years, and they'll say things like, "Oh, there's only a couple little bits of metadata out there about me," but once you start putting up together all this kind of stuff that gets leaked out over time, it suddenly can create a very big profile on you, which could be used at some point down the road for ID theft or anything like that. I've heard some interesting examples too of just making it easier to harass or intimidate. You can just order pizzas to someone's house that they don't want, or call out police threats and stuff like that, which can be quite an easy way to get at someone, but it's gets the lulls for who's ever mad at you.
Yeah, swatting has been something that's more of a recent phenomenon, especially as those streaming social media and people wanting to attract followers, or people with that malicious intent for somebody lower level like me. If I've wronged a coworker or somebody I was in a relationship with, they might have that personal vendetta where it's not going to close my business down, but I certainly don't want that swatting of police officers and law enforcement showing up for bomb threats, because that's obviously a waste of resources. There's criminality behind that act. And there's been examples where people have been killed in those examples where, innocent people have been at home. Somebody swats them with a bomb threat or a domestic disturbance, and law enforcement shows up ready to act based on a serious threat level. So probably not the intent, but the outcome is such a wide spectrum that it can absolutely pose a risk in every capacity.
So Tristan, why don't we get into some of the takeaways for our audience here? How do we protect ourselves from getting doxxed, and then maybe what to do with this after? So let's jump right into that then. How can I, as a security professional, protect my VIP or an executive at my company from getting doxxed in the first place?
Well, there's some pretty common examples of how you may want to do that. The password 123 is not a viable password anymore. This isn't the mid-90s. You have to be creative and complex with your text-based passwords. Anytime you can incorporate things like two-factor authentication or biometrics or any other type of that second level of authentication is going to help keep information secure. if it's really high level or high profile individuals leveraging things like VPNs or anonymous web browsers to really minimize how they're leaving that breadcrumb trail out there. One thing I always say is if you're going to those forums or websites and says, hey, do you want to sign in with Google or Facebook? You don't want to do that. You typically want to be very proactive in funneling potentially sensitive information to somewhere that's not vulnerable. Create an email address or something to sign up for these newsletters or websites that, hey, if this gets breached in any way, I really don't care because there's not a lot of information there. So a couple of things that you can do to be more just informed and best practices around it that you should be taking.
I've had some interesting conversations on the podcast now, especially in the OSINT world, with the problems of people directories, where so much of our personal information just gets vacuumed up and then just released out in the open for everyone to see. And I was kind of surprised when I was starting to go through a lot of these different directories, how much of the information they had collected on me to start taking down. So I thought that was kind of a surprising threat vector that not a lot of people think about at first glance.
The one that was most interesting to me wasn't even the information about me, but how you can actually really learn a lot about my network over people that have shared a phone number or shared an address. And oftentimes that will be parents, siblings, children. And then you can branch out even further. So who are connected to the kids? What are their social media accounts, which aren't typically locked down as much? It can be that in for people to get more sensitive information or pretend to be somebody to obtain that information. That's highlights the importance of being aware of what's out there and what those risk levels are. So it's not just taking preventative action. It's often running searches to see what information is out there. What are those aggregator type sites or people finder sites? What information's there? And is there options for any type of takedown services to be more proactive? You don't want to just let it sit there, but if there is a means to get it pulled down, even places like pay sites have a means to pull down information. So it's identify it, monitor it on a fairly regular basis, and then take that immediate action to pull it down. Because if an Elon Musk type person or a famous executive type person was to be doxxed or have that information released, it won't take long, especially if there's kind of targeted threat stalking risk to them, for it to be shared way more openly. And now once it's on social media platforms that's getting shared and reposted, it's impossible to keep up with once it's out there.
Well, the keyword that I clicked into there was monitoring, and that's kind of where I wanted to get into next. What kind of steps do you recommend that clients take to monitor for doxings online?
It's often just running automated searches to check those places where information are being released. And sometimes it's running searches for names. If you have access on a security team to sensitive information and can run searches in a secure environment for information like phone numbers, addresses, email addresses, specific passwords they might be utilizing, all kinds of different ways that you can search for that information out there to automate that collection or be that more proactive approach. Because being reactive, you've probably missed the boat as far as identifying information to take those preventative steps. So automating those searches, being in tune with who are the potential threat actors that could target you, who has known to do it in the past, and where are there sources online that talk about this, not from a risk perspective, but an intelligence, and who's being targeted, why are people being targeted? And if your protectees fall within that group, you may want to direct some resources to monitoring a known hacker or group that could be potentially taking those steps to infiltrating a network or cracking into a system. All kinds of both monitoring systems and just that activity within a network that could pose a risk to somebody or an organization.
I like that point that you just made about keeping up with the threat assessment, because your company could just be, like you've mentioned with doing business in Russia example, your company's just going about their day, everything's fine. And then all of a sudden this operation that you have in one place suddenly becomes this political hot potato, and that it can suddenly change overnight. So kind of keeping an eye on, I like that takeaway that you had there, where what's the political environment right now? Your protectee might not have a real threat of being doxxed anytime soon, but then that can just change overnight for who knows what reason.
We've really seen that in the US very recently with some really high profile legal cases and polarizing topics around abortion and gun violence recently, where politicians, where executives that take more so for executives that take a stance. Politicians are always going to take a stance, no matter how vague, but the executives that take a stance, that puts them at risk because, I alluded to earlier that there are those very polarizing political views. And regardless of what stance you take, there's going to be people that are not happy. And there's going to be fringe people that will want to retaliate for whatever reason.
What's even especially frustrating today is even not taking a stance can get you in trouble. You go one way, you have half the population mad at you. You go the other way, half. You don't go either way, both sides are mad at you at that point. So you're damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation.
Yeah, exactly.
What would you recommend, Tristan, that I do if I find out that my protectee or my principal has been doxxed online? What are kind of the action steps that I need to take at that point?
Great question. So first is document what information has been posted, who posted it, where it was posted, when it was posted. There are places that will take down that information. Often it's in violation of certain social media sites' terms of service. And if you don't capture that information before it's pulled down, then from an investigative point of view, there's not much you can do with an absence of information. Identify what those terms of services are where they're posted. So if you can take it down, you can take that immediate step to protect that information. Doxing quite often isn't illegal unless that information has been obtained illegally. So if you can identify the channels in which they went to acquire that information, or if that information is posted with the intent of causing harm to an individual, there may be laws being breached. So you may have, legal claims to contact authorities. If, for example, doxing a government employee falls under federal conspiracy laws, so it is against the law to do that. So you can actually start to involve law enforcement, compile your information, and be a little bit more aggressive in identifying and potentially placing charges against the hacker group, disgruntled person to minimize their future impact against an organization. If they're reaching that point where they're doxing executives, it's not a stretch to say that further harm, physical or cyber related, is not too far off.
Mm-hmm. So getting that down and trying to react as quickly as possible. I like that emphasis too that you put in on just documenting things, because I was talking to Kyle Baker, who's been on the show. Obviously, we all know him here at Liferaft. And just that point about getting things saved as quickly as possible, because a lot of this stuff just disappears online so quickly. And that can be absolutely key when putting together any kind of case or keeping stuff recorded for the future. How do you see this threat evolving over the next few years?
Wow, that's a difficult question. I don't see it getting better.
Okay.
I see it getting more frequent, more aggressive. I envision more individuals will be doxxed, and not just high-level executives. When I think of everything that's happened with COVID and healthcare professionals, people not satisfied with service they've received. There's been examples recently of not necessarily involving doxing, but people that received healthcare services and were very unhappy, or, in the case of hospital system, medical kidnapping. There's all kinds of people that are, perceiving that they're being mistreated or need to combat how a company or a group is treating them or a group of people. So much more vocal with the emergence of social media. Even in the last 4 or 5 years, there's so much more activity. The whole new generation is moving there, and they're much more equipped to find information and more prone to share information. So I see that happening way more frequently in the future. And I see a lot more potential examples of kind of that indirect or unintentional doxing of information, where people are just so much more frequently posting and sharing personal information and networking online, that more information becomes available and more sharing of that information, again, whether it's intentional or not, definitely an increase in the threat landscape.
Well, I kind of think about that point that you made with a lot more employees being the target of this. So I could see a lot of security teams are kind of focused on the top level executives, maybe a celebrity employee or something along those lines. But if we got to worry about nurses getting doxxed or doctors getting doxxed at a hospital or ordinary employees on the front line at any organization, I could kind of see that becoming a bigger security concern for any kind of security team.
Exactly. And it's, it doesn't take a big event to trigger somebody to do something like that. And with so much information publicly available and it's expanding every day, if you have enough time or the right tools to invest to find information, it doesn't take an overly talented person to acquire what they need to conduct or implement or become a risk or threat.
OSINT 101 can get you a long way doing this stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. We've done kind of crash courses with online searches for missing persons as part of like scavenger hunts, and people that are no risk to anybody, trying to find out where they are, or if they're alive, if we can identify who and where they're located. It's amazing what you can find even on the average person online, again, with the right tools and resources and training to uncover that information. Very powerful stuff.
All right, Tristan, let's take this thing home. What's the main takeaway you want listeners to remember from this episode?
Main takeaway for me is to be aware of what information is out there so you can take immediate preventative action to pull it down and put in the safeguards to prevent new information becoming available. The less information that's out there, the better initially, but you've got to maintain those lines of communication and data acquisition to see what's out there or what could be out there in the near future. And it's really all about mitigating risk. You're never going to have that perfect scenario where everything is always sunshine and rainbows, but you really want to avoid the one rainy day where it can really disrupt operations. So be aware of what's out there, use takedown services and protect identities wherever possible through any means possible, and be proactive in the monitoring for what's new and what's a potential threat that could occur on an ongoing basis, whether automated, internal, external, etc.
Tristan, thanks again for being on the show.
It's great, Rob. I can't wait till next time. It's always a pleasure talking to you. And I hope the security world pulls some value out of our chat today and future conversations.
All right. Well, I'll have you on for season 3. Again, that was Tristan Laugher, product specialist here at Liferaft. Thanks for listening to Talking Threat Intelligence. Never miss an episode by subscribing to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever else you listen to episodes. And if you'd like more insights on building a successful threat intelligence program, be sure to check out our resource page at liferaftinc.com/blog. That's liferaftinc.com/blog. And I hope you tune in next time.